I have in studio Stephen Sheldon. He recently bought for $355,000 a parcel of land located at the corner of Hawthorn and Irving Street in the city of New Bedford. It is known as 49 Hawthorn Street. And there are some neighbors in the area, and there are some New Bedford city councilors that don't like what Mr. Sheldon has planned for the property. And I have mentioned it on the program before, and I've talked to Stephen Sheldon about this. You know, people are using the term sober house dealing with this property, and I suppose you can say that name works. But the fact of the matter is, it is an apartment building, or going to be an apartment building, housing sober people. And one could ask the question, oh, wow, why do we have to have a sober house around here? Let's turn it around just a little bit. Do you want a bunch of drunks running up and down your neighborhood? So let's get into it. 49 Hawthorn Street, historic building in a great neighborhood. And it's a piece of property that the current owner looked at and said, you know what? I can do something here which is similar to what I've done in Lowell. And I can lease out rooms here for X amount of dollars. I can cover my mortgage and all of my operating costs dealing with the building. I can give people who are up and on their feet a chance to move forward and to have housing with like-minded people. Now, that's Brian speaking, and I'm not sure that our guest would say it quite the same way. And I know that there are others out there who are saying, not in my neighborhood. We have city councilors that are saying the very same thing. So with all of that stated, we've had an editorial in today's Standard Times in regards to this, the Hour View. We have had a couple of newspaper stories this week dealing with the meeting that happened at the appointments and whatever board meeting that the city council had not too long ago. And then, of course, a couple of weeks ago when Mr. Sheldon introduced himself to the bed and breakfast owner who was a neighbor to his property. So there has been a lot written about this property, a lot stated about this property on the program. Dan and Jim have run news stories with some of the city councilors who seem to be very adamant about a, quote, house for sober people on Hawthorn Street. So, without further ado, what I'd like to do is bring in the new owner of that property, 49 Hawthorn, Stephen Sheldon. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Steve Sheldon, SJS Holdings. We own rental property, and I purchased the house on Hawthorn Street to use it for housing for those who want to live in a sober environment. It's a single-family home, and it will remain a single-family home. The folks would rent it as a group and live a sober lifestyle.
As far as, let's just look at the law right now, just the law. Is there anything wrong, zoning-wise, doing what you want to do with that property?
I don't believe so. There's been multiple cases heard by the United States Supreme Court and on a state level by the SJC around this issue of protections. And they're folks in recovery, in long-term recovery, or in recovery in general, are protected by the Fair Housing Act. And it specifically stops towns from both regulating or discriminating or using redlining practices to stop folks from living in a neighborhood.
And you've done this before. You have a house like this in Lowell, correct?
And Worcester.
Worcester, and so you have more than one house like this. How's it? When did you first start doing it?
I started doing this about 6 months ago.
About 6 months ago, and during that first 6-month period, how has this worked for you as a business owner and for the residents in that particular neighborhood or neighborhoods in Lowell and Worcester?
There is some trepidation always when the house first comes in, but these guys are great neighbors. In fact, they live a lifestyle that is clearly sober for the most part. You do have some recidivism, but very little. They go to meetings, they work, they have to be able to afford the house, and we screen them before they come in. So in the end, they turn out to be great neighbors.
So you screen them. How do you go about screening them? What's in that screening process?
Everything that a typical rental would have. So we screen for employment, landlord references. We do a background screening using the Corey system, criminal. We also check for sexual predator databases on a federal level, and that's also covered under Corey, but we do a separate one. And that is the basics of the background screening.
So the big question would be, you're running a house for sober people, which others have called a sober house. What makes yours any different? I mean, people are going to worry, and I think naturally so, about people relapsing.
Sure. It's my house, it doesn't make any difference. There's a segment of people in long-term recovery that go from year one on, and we typically try to get people about a year out. So before that, they're in different types of recovery homes. It may be a rehab, it may be a day program, it may be an inpatient program, and that typically takes someone out to about a year. From that point on is when someone may live in a house like mine, and the goal is to get that person from year 1 to year 5. And at year 5, very typically about 85% of people will stay sober for the rest of their lives.
So you're basically phase 2 of a transition period for these folks.
There's a continuum of care, and yes, we're further down the road from what a rehab would be.
I need to ask this question. You've been doing this for roughly 6 months. How many people have relapsed? Have you had to force out? You do have a stipulation in your lease that requires them to remain sober.
We do.
And so how many people have fallen off the wagon?
2 people have fallen off the wagon. And we make provisions, and there's no absolute certainty, but we make provisions when people come in and they make a plan. What happens if you fall off the wagon? Where do you want to go? We try to have relationships, or have the folks who are running the house have relationships with local rehabs, IOPs, intensive outpatient programs, and the folks will either be readmitted if they're willing to. It's a voluntary thing to be readmitted to a rehab, or add something additional like an IOP, which gives someone 3.5 hours, 5 days a week of additional intensive counseling. And this, in both cases, both people had chosen to voluntarily go back, and then we took them back to the house.
So they did a program, and you let them back in. I think people wonder and maybe worry. They relapsed, they left, you're letting them back in. What happens if they relapse again? Any thought about that?
It's possible, and it's tough to say what relapse means. But in this case, and very often, this is what relapse looked like. I got a phone call from the house coordinator who said, I just heard from someone. He admitted to having a drink. He's going to put himself into a rehab. He didn't come back to the house. There wasn't any kind of disruption at the house. Most of these guys are very much into where they live. They're supportive of their other members of the house, and they don't bring their addictions back to the house. I'm not saying it can't happen, but in both cases, it did not happen.
Fair enough. You want 8 people in the house on Hawthorn Street. Will they be all the same sex?
Yes.
So there's no chance of that type of commingling?
There's not. Some houses, not mine, but some houses, very few are co-ed. Most are either male or female.
Now, you say most houses. You have 2. You're looking to start a 3rd. Is this program something that you found somebody else doing? Are you reinventing the wheel? What exactly is going on here?
So I have 2 different types of houses. I have one where I actually have a manager who manages a house, and then I'm actually opening a couple others, but I'm using something called a system that was developed by an outfit called the Oxford Houses. And they're self-run houses. There's about 1,000 of them across the United States, and they have been around for 30-odd years.
What made you decide to go this particular route?
In terms of the auction house or the housing in general?
Well, I can understand housing in general. It's a great income source. I'm talking about a house for sober people.
I've been involved in the community for many years in terms of the homeless, volunteering mostly with people, and it turns out that a lot of people who are homeless have addiction problems. So I've been around that community for many years.
Are you a former addict?
I'm not.
So this is something that you did you ever look at this as a great way to make money?
Absolutely. It's a for-profit business. The money is not significantly better than a typical rental. In fact, it's very, very similar. But
my guess is down the road, if it works the way that it is intended to work, it will be better because you will have reliable tenants who will be paying consistently month in and month out. And unless they decide to go off and get married, start a family, whatever, or reunite with family, they're not going to want to leave.
Absolutely.